A millionaire on a blind date laughed at a single dad's clothes at an upscale Vienna restaurant, then froze when the waiter said 4 words that made no sense. The dining room at Palais Auersperg glows with candlelight and old money. Crystal chandeliers throw fractured light across white tablecloths. The air smells like seared scallops and wine that costs more than most people make in a week. At table 7, a woman in a black cocktail dress reaches for the leather check holder. Confident. Entitled. She'd spent the last 2 hours systematically humiliating the man across from her. The one in the borrowed suit with frayed cuffs and department store shoes. The one who ordered water while she ordered a €400 bottle of wine. The waiter stops her hand mid-reach. No need, Frau von Ehrenberg. The gentleman already settled the entire evening. She freezes. Actually, freezes. Her perfectly manicured fingers hover above the check like she's touched something electric. I'm sorry. What? The bill has been paid. Herr Lindemann covered everything. Her mind goes blank. She'd ordered over €1,200 of food and wine, an amount she'd chosen specifically to humiliate him, to make the gap between their worlds grotesque and undeniable. A security guard's salary in Vienna is maybe €2,000 a month. This bill is more than half that. The man, the one she'd mocked for working nights with a flashlight and a polyester uniform, stands without a word. His calloused hands rest briefly on the table. Perfectly still. Perfectly controlled. He looks at her for the first time all evening with something other than quiet endurance. I hope you enjoyed your meal, Frau von Ehrenberg, he says, calm, almost gentle. I'm sure your foundation does important work. Then he walks out. The woman sits in the wreckage of her own cruelty, unable to process what just happened. The couple beside her is silent. Someone across the table murmurs, "Well, that was gracious of him." She feels something crawling up her spine she hasn't felt in years. Shame. But here's what she doesn't know yet. What nobody in that room knows. The man she just humiliated isn't a security guard who got lucky with a credit card. He's a ghost. And the world she's about to pull him back into will destroy her. If you believe that true dignity isn't about what you can afford, but what you refuse to accept, stay with this story. Because what happens when a millionaire philanthropist tries to bury the man who embarrassed her will restore your faith in quiet strength. Before we begin, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person? Because this one's going to hurt. But to understand how a single father working night security became the most talked about man in Vienna's elite music world, we need to go back. Back to the morning this all started. Back to a cramped apartment in Favoriten where a man wakes his daughter the same way he does every single day, pretending yesterday didn't break something inside him. The alarm clock rang at 6:30 in the morning. Gregor Lindemann reached out from under thin blankets and silenced it with one practiced motion. No snooze button, no lying in bed staring at the ceiling, just the immediate shift from sleep to movement that came from 4 years of the same routine. He stood in the small bedroom of their apartment in Favoriten and pulled on yesterday's jeans. The radiator clanked and hissed. Outside the window, Vienna was still dark. February cold seeped through the glass. Down the narrow hallway, he pushed open Emma's door. She was already awake, sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, humming. Always humming. This morning it was something from Vivaldi. Perfect pitch. She didn't know where the melodies came from. They just lived inside her. "Good morning, Kleine," Gregor said quietly. Emma looked up and smiled. "Morning, Papa." He made breakfast while she got dressed. Toast with butter, scrambled eggs, orange juice from a carton. The kitchen was barely wide enough for one person to move comfortably. The tiles were cracked. The overhead light buzzed. But it was warm, and it was theirs. Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her school uniform. Navy sweater, gray skirt, knee socks that never quite stayed up. Her dark hair was tangled. "Come here," Gregor said. She sat at the small table. He stood behind her and worked through the knots with his fingers, gentle and patient. Her mother's hair had been the same. Thick, stubborn, beautiful. They ate together in comfortable silence. Emma hummed between bites. Gregor watched her and felt the same quiet ache he felt every morning. Gratitude and grief tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them anymore. At 7:45, they walked to school. The streets were crowded with commuters. Emma's hand fit inside his like it always had. She was small for 10, anxious around strangers, but when they were alone together, she was fearless. "Papa," she said as they reached the school gates, "why don't you ever talk about before?" Gregor's chest tightened. "Before what?" "Before Mama died. Frau Myers says you used to do something else, not security." He crouched down so they were eye level. "Frau Meyer talks too much." Emma's face grew serious. "Did you? Do something else?" "Different work," Gregor said. "A long time ago." "What kind of work?" He kissed her forehead. "Go. You'll be late." She hugged him and ran toward the building. At the door, she turned and waved. He waved back. Then she disappeared inside, and Gregor stood alone on the sidewalk, watching the space where she'd been. He went home, slept 4 hours, woke at 2 in the afternoon with sunlight slanting through the blinds, made coffee, stared at the television without turning it on. At 6, he put on his uniform. Polyester. 2 sizes too large. A name tag that said Lindemann in block letters. No first name, no history. The Wiener Staatsoper sat in the heart of Vienna like a jewel. Gregor arrived through the employee entrance and signed in with the night supervisor. The building was empty. Performances didn't start until 7:30. His shift began at 6. He walked the corridors with a flashlight that flickered when he moved too fast. The beam cut through dim hallways lined with photographs of conductors and soloists. Faces he used to know. Names that used to mean something. At 8, he paused outside the main auditorium. Through the small window in the door, he could see the stage. Empty now. The orchestra pit dark. The velvet seats stretching back into shadow. He stood there longer than he should have. His hand rested on the door handle. He didn't go in. He never went in. By midnight, the building was silent except for his footsteps. He checked doors, tested locks, made notes on his clipboard. Security guard work. Simple. Invisible. Exactly what he needed. He got home at 2 in the morning. Emma was asleep. He stood in her doorway and listened to her breathe. Then he went to his own room and lay down in the dark. The next evening, Frau Meyer came to visit. She was Emma's music teacher. Older. Kind. The type of woman who saw through polite deflections. Gregor opened the door and saw her standing in the hallway with a covered dish. "I made too much goulash," she said. "You didn't make too much," Gregor said. "I did, and you'll help me eat it, or it will go to waste." She came inside. Emma was at the table doing homework. She looked up and grinned. "Frau Meyer." "Hello, Liebchen. How was school?" They ate together. Frau Meyer talked about the upcoming school concert. Emma talked about a boy in her class who couldn't carry a tune. Gregor said very little. After dinner, Emma went to her room to practice violin. Badly. Earnestly. The notes drifted down the hallway like a prayer. Frau Meyer sat across from Gregor at the small kitchen table. She folded her hands and looked at him with the same gentle directness she probably used on struggling students. "It's been 4 years, Gregor." He didn't look up. "I know." "Emma is thriving. You're doing a wonderful job with her." "Thank you. But she needs to see you live, not just survive." Gregor's jaw tightened. "I am living." "You're going through motions. There's a difference." Frau Meyer's voice softened. "I have a friend, a good woman, cultured. She loves music. I thought perhaps you might meet her. Just dinner. Nothing serious." "No, Gregor. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but no." Frau Meyer studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and stood. "The offer stands. When you're ready." She left. Gregor sat alone at the table, staring at his hands. Scarred. Calloused. Hands that used to do something else. He didn't hear Emma come down the hallway. When he looked up, she was standing in the doorway. Small, watching him with eyes too old for her face. "Papa," she said quietly, "Mama would want you to be happy." Gregor's throat closed. Emma walked over and climbed into his lap. Something she rarely did anymore. She rested her head against his chest. "I want you to be happy," she whispered. And in that moment, Gregor felt something inside him crack. 3 days later, Gregor called Frau Meyer and told her yes. She didn't ask what changed his mind. She just smiled and said she'd make the arrangements. The dinner was set for Friday evening, a cultural networking event at the Palais Auersperg. Frau Meyer explained it carefully over the phone. Arts patrons and music professionals. A charity initiative. Nothing too formal, just conversation and a nice meal. "Your match is someone from the philanthropic world," Frau Meyer said. "Very accomplished. She loves music." Gregor's stomach twisted. "What's her name?" "I don't have all the details. The organizers handle the pairings, but you'll like her, Gregor. I'm certain." He wasn't certain of anything. On Thursday, he borrowed a suit from his supervisor at the Staatsoper. The man was shorter and wider than Gregor. The jacket strained at the shoulders. The pants were too short. But it was formal clothing, and Gregor owned nothing else. Friday evening arrived too quickly. Gregor stood in his bedroom, struggling with the tie. His hands shook. Emma appeared in the doorway, watching him. "You need help, Papa?" He nodded. She climbed onto the bed behind him and reached around to adjust the knot. Her small fingers worked with surprising confidence. "Frau Meyer showed me," she said. "In case you forgot." Gregor's throat tightened. "Thank you, Kleine." She finished and stepped back to look at him. Her face lit up. "You look handsome, Papa." He looked down at himself. The suit was terrible. The tie was crooked despite her best efforts. His shoes were 15 years old, scuffed beyond saving. "I look like I'm going to a funeral," he muttered. "No," Emma said firmly. "You look nice." She took his hand and squeezed it. Her palm was warm and small against his. "Mama would think so too." Something in Gregor's chest cracked all over again. He knelt down so they were eye level. "I'll be back by 10. Frau Meyer will be here with you." "I know. If you need anything." "Papa." Emma put her hands on his cheeks. "Go. It's okay." He kissed her forehead and stood. The doorbell rang. Frau Meyer, right on time. Gregor took the U-Bahn to the city center. The train was crowded with Friday night crowds, people in sleek coats and expensive shoes, heading to restaurants and theaters. Gregor stood near the door, gripping the handle, trying to breathe. He got off at Stephansplatz and walked. The Palais Auersperg sat just beyond the Ringstrasse, a converted Baroque palace with pale yellow walls and arched windows glowing from within. Gregor stopped across the street and stared. People were arriving. Men in tailored suits, women in cocktail dresses. A valet stood at the entrance, opening car doors. Gregor looked down at his borrowed jacket, at his scuffed shoes. He almost turned around. But then he thought of Emma's hands on his cheeks, her quiet certainty. He crossed the street. Inside, the entrance hall was all marble and gold. Chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. A woman at a reception desk checked names against a list. Gregor gave his. She smiled and handed him a small card with a table number. Table 7. Enjoy your evening, Herr Lindemann. The dining room was massive, round tables draped in white linen, candles flickering in crystal holders. The air smelled like roses and expensive wine. Gregor found table 7 near the center of the room. 4 other guests were already seated. They glanced up as he approached, their smiles polite but brief. Gregor sat in the empty chair and folded his hands in his lap. His palms were slick with sweat. Across the city, Katharina von Ehrenberg sat in the back of a hired car, staring out the window at the passing streets. Her assistant had called that afternoon with an update. The conductor she was supposed to meet had canceled. Last-minute conflict. The organizers were scrambling to find a replacement match. They said they have someone, her assistant explained, deeply connected to the Staatsoper. They think you'll find him very interesting. Katharina's jaw tightened. She hated last-minute changes. She hated being managed by well-meaning board members who thought she needed socializing like she was some kind of charity case. But she'd agreed to this evening weeks ago. And backing out now would only give them more reason to whisper about her isolation. The car pulled up to the Palais Auersperg. Katharina stepped out, smoothing her black dress. She was perfectly composed. Hair pulled back. Minimal jewelry. The kind of elegance that required no effort, because it had been ingrained since birth. Inside, the reception desk directed her to table 7. She walked through the dining room with her head high, ignoring the glances. She knew half the people here. Donors, board members, people who smiled at her in public and gossiped about her divorce in private. She reached table 7 and scanned the faces. An older couple she recognized vaguely, a younger woman in a green dress, and a man sitting with his back to her, shoulders hunched, hands folded. The empty chair was beside him. Katharina sat down. The man turned toward her. Their eyes met. He was nervous. She could see it immediately. The way he held himself. The cheap suit that didn't fit. The department store tie. He looked out of place. Uncomfortable. She smiled politely, extended her hand. Katharina von Ehrenberg. He hesitated, then shook her hand. His palm was calloused. Rough. Gregor Lindemann. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Katharina's mind raced. This was her match? This was the man deeply connected to the Staatsoper? She kept her smile in place and turned to the rest of the table, making introductions. But inside, a small, cold certainty was already forming. Someone had made a mistake. Katharina turned back to the table and picked up her menu. Her smile was polished, professional, the kind that gave nothing away. So, Herr Lindemann, she said, tell me about your work at the Staatsoper. What do you do there? Gregor's throat tightened. He looked down at his water glass, then back at her. Security, he said quietly. The word hung in the air. Katharina's smile didn't move. But something in her eyes shifted. She glanced down at his hands, at the frayed cuffs of his borrowed jacket, at the department store tie that didn't quite match. Her gaze returned to his face. The warmth was gone. "Security," she repeated. "I see." She set down her menu and leaned back in her chair. The couple beside them continued their conversation, oblivious. But Gregor felt the temperature at the table drop. A waiter appeared with menus bound in leather. Katerina opened hers without looking at Gregor. "I'll start with the oysters," she said. Her voice was bright, performative. "Then the tasting menu, and a bottle of the Gruner Veltliner, the 2018. The waiter nodded and turned to Gregor. Gregor scanned the menu. His eyes caught on the prices. The tasting menu was €80. The wine was over 400. "Just the schnitzel," he said, "and water is fine." Katerina glanced at him over the top of her menu. Her expression was unreadable. "Please, don't feel pressured to keep up," she said. The words were light, almost kind, but the edge beneath them was sharp. "I'm sure you have budget considerations." Heat rose in Gregor's face. He nodded and looked away. The waiter collected the menus and disappeared. Katerina turned to the woman in the green dress beside her and began talking about an upcoming gallery opening. Gregor sat in silence, his hands folded in his lap. The oysters arrived. Katerina ate them slowly, making small comments about the quality. She asked the couple across the table about their recent trip to Paris. She laughed at something the man said. Her voice carried across the table, filling the space. Gregor's schnitzel arrived. He cut into it carefully, trying not to draw attention. Katerina turned back to him as her next course was served. A delicate piece of fish with foam and microgreens arranged like art. "So," she said, "what did you do before security work?" Gregor chewed slowly, swallowed. "Different work," he said. "A long time ago." Katerina's eyebrows lifted. She took a sip of wine. "How mysterious." Her tone was mocking, light. "Let me guess. Aspiring musician. They all work security at the Staatsoper eventually." The man across the table chuckled. Gregor said nothing. His hands, resting beside his plate, were perfectly still. Katerina continued eating. She talked about her foundation's work funding youth music programs, about the galas she hosted, about the musicians she'd discovered and mentored. Every word was chosen to remind the table of her position, her importance. "It's exhausting sometimes," she said, glancing at Gregor, "but someone has to support the arts. Some of us are meant to create, others are meant to support." The implication was clear. Gregor cut another piece of schnitzel. He didn't look up. "Do you have children, Herr Lindemann?" Katerina asked. "Yes," Gregor said. "A daughter." Katerina nodded. Her face softened into something that looked like sympathy, but felt like pity. "How noble," she said. "Raising a child on a security salary, that must be difficult. I'm sure she's very grateful you try." The words landed like a slap. Gregor's jaw tightened. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. But he didn't respond. He set the fork down gently and reached for his water. The woman in the green dress glanced at him, then away. Katerina leaned toward the couple beside her and lowered her voice just enough that Gregor could still hear. "I think there's been some confusion with the seating arrangements," she said. "Wires getting crossed. You know how these things are." The couple nodded politely but didn't engage. Dessert arrived, a trio of delicate pastries for Katerina. Nothing for Gregor, who hadn't ordered any. Katerina ate slowly, savoring each bite. She talked about the burden of funding scholarships for families who needed help, about the importance of knowing one's place in the cultural ecosystem, about how the world worked best when people understood their roles. "There's a natural order to these things," she said, gesturing with her fork. "People who create, people who support, people who facilitate. Everyone has their place. She looked directly at Gregor. Don't you think? Gregor met her eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. I suppose. Katerina smiled, satisfied. The table around them had gone quiet. The couple beside Gregor stared at their plates. The woman in the green dress excused herself to speak with someone at another table. By the time the waiter began clearing dessert plates, Katerina had made it clear to everyone within earshot that this evening was beneath her, that she'd been paired with someone who didn't belong, that this was a mistake she'd tolerate only because leaving early would be rude. Gregor sat in the wreckage of her words, staring at his empty water glass. His hands rested on the table, perfectly still, perfectly controlled. Katerina checked her phone and sighed. Excuse me, she said, standing. I need to make a call. She walked toward the restroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor. As she disappeared through the doorway, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Fix this disaster, she wrote to her assistant. I want names. Who approved this seating? At the table, Gregor sat alone. The couple beside him exchanged an uncomfortable glance, but said nothing. The waiter approached with the check, and Gregor made a decision. Katerina returned to the table 5 minutes later. Her expression was composed, controlled. She'd fixed her lipstick in the mirror and sent 3 terse messages to her assistant. By the time she sat down, she'd already decided how the rest of the evening would go. She'd pay her half of the bill, make a polite excuse about an early meeting, leave before coffee, and tomorrow she'd make a few calls. Someone would answer for this disaster. The waiter was clearing the last of the dessert plates. Katerina reached for her purse and withdrew her card. The leather check holder sat at the center of the table. She picked it up. The waiter appeared at her elbow. His timing was impeccable. No need, Frau von Ehrenberg. Katerina looked up. I'm sorry? The gentleman already settled the entire evening. Katerina's hand froze. She stared at the waiter, then at Gregor. I'm sorry. What? The waiter's voice was perfectly neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes, the faintest hint of satisfaction. The bill has been paid. Herr Lindemann covered everything. Katerina's mind went blank. She looked down at the check holder in her hand, then back at the waiter, then at Gregor, who sat with his hands folded, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. There must be a mistake, she said. No mistake, Frau von Ehrenberg. Katerina's pulse hammered in her throat. She'd ordered over 1,200 euros of food and wine, oysters, the tasting menu, a bottle that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. She'd chosen each item specifically because it was excessive, because it would make the gap between them grotesque. A security guard's salary in Vienna was maybe 2,000 euros a month. This bill was more than half that. He couldn't possibly afford this, unless he'd done something reckless. Put it on credit, borrowed money, destroyed his finances to salvage his pride in front of her. The thought made her stomach turn. Herr Lindemann, she said, turning to him. Her voice was tight. This is unnecessary. I can pay my share. Gregor stood. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. He rose from his chair with a quiet deliberateness that made the table fall silent. He looked at her for the first time all evening with something other than quiet endurance. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. I hope you enjoyed your meal, Frau von Ehrenberg. He nodded to the couple beside him, then to the woman in the green dress. I'm sure your foundation does important work, he said to Katerina. Then he walked out, just like that. No explanation, no anger, no attempt to explain how he'd paid a bill that should have been impossible for him. He simply left. Katerina sat frozen. The check holder was still in her hand. The waiter had disappeared. The couple beside her stared at their wine glasses. Someone across the table murmured, "Well, that was gracious of him." The words landed like a blow. Gracious. The security guard in the borrowed suit, who'd sat through 2 hours of her systematic cruelty, had just been called gracious by someone at her table about an act of defiance she didn't understand. Katerina's face burned. She set down the check holder and reached for her wine. Her hand trembled slightly. She took a long sip and forced her expression back into something smooth, unreadable. But inside, something was shifting. The couple beside her made polite excuses and left. The woman in the green dress followed shortly after. Within 10 minutes, Katerina sat alone at table 7, staring at the empty chair across from her. The shame she'd felt when the waiter announced the bill was paid began to curdle into something sharper. Who was this man? Gregor Lindemann, security guard at the Staatsoper. Single father, raising a daughter on a salary that barely covered rent. A man who'd sat through her humiliation without a word of protest. And yet he'd paid 1,200 euros without flinching. How? Katerina pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. She opened her contacts, scrolled to the Staatsoper's administrative director, a woman she'd met at 3 different galas, someone who owed her foundation favors. She typed a message. "I need information on an employee. Gregor Lindemann, Security Division. Anything you can find." She hit send. Then she opened a search engine and typed his name. Nothing. No social media. No professional profiles. No trace of him beyond what little the evening had revealed. She tried adding Vienna, Staatsoper, security. Still nothing. It was as if he didn't exist outside the walls of that building. Katerina's jaw tightened. She thought about the way he'd sat, perfectly still, hands controlled, not fidgeting, not defensive, just enduring. Like someone who'd learned a long time ago how to wait out a storm. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he stood to leave. Not angry, not wounded, just calm, steady. Like he'd made a choice and was at peace with it. That look bothered her more than anything else. Her phone buzzed. A reply from the administrative director. "I'll look into it. Give me until Monday." Katerina set down her phone. She finished her wine, signed the receipt the waiter brought, and walked out of the Palais Auersperg with her head high and her spine straight. But her mind wouldn't stop turning. Gregor Lindemann had just done something impossible, and Katerina von Ehrenberg didn't believe in impossible without an explanation. She would find out who he really was, and when she did, she would make him regret humiliating her. Gregor walked home through the cold Vienna night. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets. His breath came out in white clouds. The city was quiet at this hour. Empty streets, distant sirens, the occasional taxi passing by. He climbed the stairs to his apartment slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the lights were still on. Frau Meyer sat on the couch reading a book. She looked up when Gregor entered. "How was it?" she asked gently. Gregor unbuttoned his borrowed jacket. "Fine." Frau Meyer's eyes searched his face. She didn't believe him. But she also knew better than to push. "Emma fell asleep around 9. She's in her room." "Thank you for staying." Frau Meyer gathered her things and stood. At the door, she paused. "Gregor, whatever happened tonight, you did the right thing by going. That took courage." He nodded, but said nothing. After she left, Gregor checked on Emma. She was curled under her blankets, breathing softly. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep. Then he closed the door and walked to the kitchen. He sat at the small table, pulled out his phone, opened his banking app. The payment had gone through. 1,247 euros. More than half his month's salary. Money he hadn't touched in 4 years. He stared at the screen until it went dark. Then the memories came. 6 years ago, the Vienna Philharmonic Rehearsal Hall was alive with sound. 70 musicians tuning their instruments. The air smelled like rosin and old wood. Light poured through tall windows, catching dust in golden shafts. Gregor Lindemann Richter stood at the podium, 30 years old, already being called a prodigy. He raised his hands, and the orchestra fell silent. In the first violin chair sat Anneliese, his wife. Her dark hair pulled back, her bow poised. She caught his eye and smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it said everything. He lowered his hands, and the music began. It was Mahler, Symphony No. 1, the piece that had brought them together. Gregor conducted, and Anneliese played, and the sound that filled the hall was transcendent, not because of technical perfection, because of understanding. They didn't need to speak. Every gesture, every breath, every pause was shared. After rehearsal, they walked home together through the city. Anneliese's violin case swung at her side. "You pushed the tempo in the third movement," she said. "I know. Did it work?" "Almost." She threaded her arm through his. "Try it again tomorrow. But give us 2 more beats before the shift." Gregor kissed the top of her head. "What would I do without you?" "Conduct slower," she said, and laughed. The memory shifted. 4 years ago. Late November. Rain hammering against the windshield. Gregor drove with both hands tight on the wheel. The highway to Salzburg was slick and dark. Headlights from oncoming traffic blurred through the water. In the passenger seat, Anneliese leaned her head against the window. Her eyes were closed. "We could have left in the morning," she said quietly. "We'd hit traffic. We'd be late." "Gregor, I'm exhausted." "I know, but this concert matters. Richter will be there. If he hears us and likes what he hears, it could mean La Scala." Anneliese opened her eyes, looked at him. "Does it always have to be about the next thing?" "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Gregor's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He focused on the road, on the rain, on the taillights ahead of them. 10 minutes later, the truck crossed the median. Gregor saw the headlights, saw them coming. He jerked the wheel to the right. Not fast enough. The impact was metal and glass, and the sound of everything breaking at once. When Gregor opened his eyes, he was upside down. Blood ran down his face, his seatbelt cut into his chest. The airbag hung deflated in front of him. He turned his head. Anneliese wasn't moving. The memory ended there. It always ended there. Gregor sat in his kitchen in the present, staring at nothing. The refrigerator hummed. A pipe clanked somewhere in the walls. His hands rested on the table, palms down. He'd survived the crash with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. Anneliese died on impact. He'd walked away from everything after that. The concerts, the acclaim, the name that opened doors. He couldn't stand on a podium without seeing her empty chair. Couldn't hear music without hearing what was missing. He took the job at the Staatsoper because it kept him close to the world he'd lost, but didn't require him to be part of it. He became invisible. Nobody asked questions. Nobody knew his name. Nobody expected anything from him except to walk hallways and check locks. It was safer that way. For him. For Emma. Gregor stood and walked to his bedroom. He opened the closet and pulled a box down from the top shelf. Dust coated the lid. He set it on the bed and lifted the cover. Inside were concert programs, photographs, reviews from newspapers, a baton wrapped in cloth. He picked up the baton. Annalisa had given it to him the night he conducted Mahler's First for the first time. Professionally, with the Philharmonic. She'd had it engraved, for the music we make together. Gregor held it in both hands. The weight was familiar, the balance perfect. He thought about the 1,200 euros, money from a trust his agent had set up years ago, investment returns from a life he'd abandoned. He'd never touched it. It felt wrong, like profiting from the ambition that had killed her. But tonight, sitting across from Katerina's cruelty, he'd made a choice. Not for pride, for Emma. He couldn't let his daughter grow up thinking her father was someone who could be humiliated without response. That dignity was something you earned through money or status. He wanted her to know it was something else, something deeper. It was about what you refused to accept. Gregor set the baton back in the box. He closed the lid and returned it to the closet. His phone rang. The sound cut through the silence. He pulled it from his pocket. Blocked number. Unknown caller. It rang again. Gregor stared at the screen. Something in his chest tightened. He let it ring a third time. A fourth. Then he set the phone down on the nightstand and let it go to voicemail. He didn't want to know who was calling. Not yet. Monday morning, Katerina sat in her office on the third floor of a building overlooking the Ringstrasse. Floor-to-ceiling windows, white furniture, everything polished to a shine. She hadn't slept well since Friday night. Her assistant had sent the information Sunday evening. Gregor Lindemann, security guard, night shift, employed at the Staatsoper for 4 years. No disciplinary record. No social media presence. No visible history before that. Katerina stared at the file on her desk. 4 years at the same institution her foundation funded. The same building where she hosted galas, where her name appeared on donor walls. She picked up her phone and dialed. The Staatsoper's administrative director answered on the second ring. Katerina, what a pleasant surprise. Good morning, Elizabeth. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. What can I do for you? Katerina leaned back in her chair. Her voice was smooth, professional. I need to discuss a personnel matter. One of your security staff, Gregor Lindemann. There was a pause on the other end. Is there a problem? I'm not certain yet, but I've received some concerning information. Inappropriate conduct. Nothing concrete, but troubling enough that I thought you should be aware. What kind of conduct? Katerina's fingers drummed against her desk. I'd rather not go into details over the phone, but given the Foundation's relationship with the Staatsoper, I felt obligated to bring this to your attention. Discreetly. Another pause. Longer this time. I see. I'll look into it. I appreciate that, Elizabeth, and I trust you'll handle this with the appropriate sensitivity. We wouldn't want any complications. The unspoken threat was clear. The Foundation donated €500,000 annually. That bought influence. Katerina ended the call and set down her phone. She told herself this was about protecting the institution, about accountability, about making sure people who worked in positions of trust were held to appropriate standards. But deep down, beneath the rationalizations, she knew the truth. This was about making Gregor Lindemann pay for humiliating her. 3 days later, Gregor was called into the administrative offices during his shift. The director of security sat behind a desk, with a folder in front of him. He didn't meet Gregor's eyes. Sit down, Lindemann. Gregor sat. His hands rested on his knees. We've received a complaint. Inappropriate conduct. The details are vague, but the source is credible. Gregor's chest tightened. What complaint? I can't discuss specifics, but after consultation with the board, we've decided to let you go. Effective immediately. The words didn't make sense. Gregor stared at the man across the desk. I haven't done anything inappropriate. That may be. But the foundation that funds our youth programming has raised concerns. We can't ignore that. The foundation. Katerina. Gregor's jaw locked. He understood now. This is a severance check. 2 weeks' pay. I need you to clear out your locker and leave the building within the hour. Gregor took the envelope. He stood without a word and walked out. 45 minutes later, he was escorted through the employee entrance by a supervisor he'd worked with for 4 years. The man wouldn't look at him. Gregor stepped onto the street in the middle of the afternoon with a cardboard box containing his flashlight, a spare uniform, and a coffee mug Emma had decorated for Father's Day. He walked home in a daze. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. Job listings for security work, building maintenance, warehouse positions. Everything required references, experience, background checks. He'd been Gregor Lindemann for 4 years. Before that, he'd been someone else, someone he couldn't go back to being. The rent was due in 12 days. He had enough savings for maybe 2 months if he was careful. Maybe 3 if he cut everything to the bone. By Thursday, they were eating pasta with butter for the 3rd night in a row. Gregor told Emma it was because he'd bought too much at the store. She didn't argue, but she watched him with quiet eyes. Friday evening, Emma asked why Papa looked so tired. Gregor said he'd been staying up too late. It wasn't a lie. He'd been awake until 3 in the morning, filling out applications that went nowhere. Saturday, they went to the park. It was free. Emma ran ahead on the path, humming. Gregor followed, his hands in his pockets, trying to remember the last time he'd felt this hollow. Sunday evening, Emma came out of her room after bedtime and found Gregor sitting in the dark living room. No lights, no television, just him, sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked over and climbed into his lap. Gregor wrapped his arms around her. She was getting too big for this, too old, but she fit against his chest the same way she always had. "Papa," she whispered, "are you sad?" His throat closed. "A little." "Is it because of the mean lady from the dinner?" Gregor went still. "How do you know about that?" "Frau Meyer told me. She said you were very brave." Gregor closed his eyes. He rested his chin on the top of Emma's head. "It's not your fault, Kleine. None of this is your fault." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, "But it's her fault, isn't it?" Gregor didn't answer. Emma shifted in his lap so she could look up at him. Her face was serious, small and fierce, and heartbreakingly direct. "Papa, you don't have to be small for me." Gregor's breath caught. "I'm not afraid of who you are," Emma said. "I'm afraid you've forgotten." The words hung in the air between them. Gregor held Emma tighter. Her small body pressed against his chest. Her breathing was soft and steady. She wasn't crying. She was just stating a fact. The way children do when they see something adults have spent years pretending isn't there. "How do you know about the dinner?" Gregor asked quietly. "Frau Meyer told me. She said you were very brave." Gregor's throat closed. He didn't feel brave. He felt like a man who'd been running for 4 years and had finally been caught. Emma shifted so she could see his face. Her eyes were serious, old beyond her years. "Papa, you don't have to be small for me." The words cut deeper than anything Katerina had said. "I'm not afraid of who you are," Emma whispered. "I'm afraid you've forgotten." Something in Gregor's chest broke open. Not violently, quietly, like ice cracking under spring sun. He kissed the top of Emma's head. "Go to bed, Kleine. It's late." "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes, I promise." Emma climbed off his lap. She stood in front of him for a moment, studying his face. Then she hugged him quickly and disappeared down the hallway. Her bedroom door clicked shut. Gregor sat alone in the dark living room. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. The building's old pipes groaned somewhere in the walls. He stood and walked to his bedroom, opened the closet, reached up to the top shelf, and pulled down the box he'd looked at just days earlier. This time, he didn't hesitate. He set the box on the bed and lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and dust filled the room. Concert programs from Vienna, Prague, Budapest, photographs of him and Annalisa backstage, both of them young and smiling, reviews from newspapers he'd stopped reading the day she died. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was the baton. Gregor lifted it out. The weight was familiar. Perfect. The engraving caught the light from the bedside lamp. "For the music we make together." He sat on the edge of the bed and held it in both hands. Emma's words echoed in his head. "You don't have to be small for me. I'm afraid you've forgotten." Had he forgotten? Or had he just convinced himself that forgetting was safer? Gregor thought about the last 4 years. The night shifts, the empty hallways, the careful avoidance of anything that reminded him of who he'd been. He told himself it was about protecting Emma, about giving her a stable life, about making sure his ambition never hurt anyone again. But maybe it had never been about that. Maybe it had always been about punishment. Gregor set the baton on the nightstand. He turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark. Sleep didn't come. He stared at the ceiling until the room began to lighten with dawn. At 7 in the morning, his phone rang. Gregor picked it up. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him press accept. "Gregor?" The voice was familiar, warm, uncertain. "Yes?" "It's Christoph. Christoph Brenner." Gregor sat up. His pulse quickened. "I heard about what happened at the Staatsoper," Christoph continued. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Gregor didn't respond. He waited. "I know you probably want nothing to do with this place anymore, but I need to ask you something." "What?" Christoph paused. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. "Do you remember the youth orchestra? The one that rehearses Thursday afternoons?" "Vaguely." "They're struggling. Their conductor left 2 months ago. The kids are talented, but they're all over the place. No focus, no discipline." Christoph exhaled. "Gregor, I know who you are. I've known since you started working here. I recognized your hands the first time I saw you check a door lock." Gregor's breath caught. "I never said anything because I figured you had your reasons. But now you're gone, and these kids need help. And I can't stop thinking that maybe this is why you came back to this building in the first place." "I came back to pay rent," Gregor said quietly. "Did you? Or did you come back because you couldn't stay away?" Gregor closed his eyes. "1 rehearsal," Christoph said. "Closed session. No publicity. No pressure. Just you and 20 kids who need to hear what real music sounds like. That's all I'm asking." "No." "Gregor." "I'm not that person anymore." "Maybe not. But those kids don't need who you were. They need someone who knows what they're doing. And whether you like it or not, that's still you." Gregor gripped the phone. His other hand reached for the baton on the nightstand. "These kids sound like a car accident," Christoph said. His voice softened. "You owe Annalisa better than letting her art die with you." The words were a knife between the ribs. Low. Unfair. True. Gregor's fingers closed around the baton. He thought about Emma's face last night. Small and fierce and unafraid. He thought about 4 years of walking empty hallways. He thought about Annalisa sitting in the first violin chair, catching his eye before the downbeat, smiling that small smile that said everything. 1 session, Gregor heard himself say. 1 session, Christoph agreed. Thursday. What time? 3 o'clock. Studio B. Gregor nodded even though Christoph couldn't see him. I'll be there. Thank you, Gregor. The call ended. Gregor sat on the edge of his bed, holding the baton Annalisa had given him 14 years ago. The room was quiet except for the sound of Emma humming in her sleep down the hall. He had no idea if he could still do this, but for the first time in 4 years, he was willing to find out. Katerina learned about the rehearsal Tuesday afternoon. Her assistant forwarded an email thread from the Staatsoper's administrative office. Youth Orchestra. Thursday at 3. Studio B. Guest conductor stepping in for a single session. The name on the email was Gregor Lindemann. Katerina sat at her desk and stared at the screen. He'd wormed his way back in. Somehow. Despite the complaint. Despite everything. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Weber, a board member she'd served with for 6 years, a man who valued discretion and understood how institutions worked. Marcus, I need your help with something. 20 minutes later, it was arranged. They'd attend the rehearsal together, observe from the back, document whatever happened. If Gregor was incompetent, they'd have evidence. If he was using the Staatsoper to embarrass her, they'd have witnesses. Thursday afternoon arrived cold and gray. Katerina wore black, tailored jacket, heels that clicked against marble as she and Marcus walked through the Staatsoper's corridors. Studio B was on the 2nd floor, a mid-sized rehearsal space with high ceilings and acoustic panels lining the walls. 20 teenagers sat with instruments in their laps. Violins, violas, cellos, woodwinds. They looked bored, restless, like they were waiting for someone who was already late. Katerina and Marcus took seats in the back row. No one noticed them. Christoph Brenner stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the students with a mixture of hope and worry. At 3:05, Gregor walked in. He wore dark pants and a simple gray sweater. No uniform, no flashlight. His hands were empty except for a single baton wrapped in cloth. The students straightened slightly. Gregor walked to the podium without introduction. He unwrapped the baton and set the cloth aside. Then he turned to face the orchestra. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't try to win them over. He simply raised his hands. The room went still. Gregor's hands hovered in the air, waiting. The students lifted their instruments, positioned their bows. A girl in the front row with a violin glanced at the boy beside her. He shrugged. Gregor's hands came down. The sound that emerged was rough, uneven. The violins started a beat too early. The cellos dragged. A clarinet squeaked. It was exactly what Christoph had described. A car accident. But Gregor didn't stop them. He kept conducting. His hands moved with small, precise gestures, a slight shift of his wrist, a tilt of his head. His eyes tracked across the orchestra, section by section, listening. After 8 bars, he stopped. The music died. Again, Gregor said quietly, "Violins, watch my left hand. Cellos, you're pulling. Stay with the downbeat." He raised his hands. They started again. This time, it was better. Not perfect, but tighter. The violins found their entrance. The cellos adjusted. The clarinet player focused, and the squeak disappeared. Gregor conducted through 16 bars. Then he stopped again. Good. Again. Woodwinds, breathe with me. You're rushing the third measure. They played, stopped, played again. Each time, something shifted. Small adjustments. A phrase that had been muddy started to clarify. A transition that had been jarring smoothed out. The students leaned forward, focused, listening not just to their own parts, but to each other. Katerina watched from the back. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair. This wasn't what she'd expected. Gregor worked through the piece section by section. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lecture. He just conducted, stopped, made a single observation, and started again. After 30 minutes, he took them through the full piece without stopping. The transformation was undeniable. The same group of teenagers who'd sounded like a car accident now sounded like an orchestra. Not professional, not polished, but coherent, musical, alive. A cello passage that had been thick and sluggish suddenly bloomed into something clear and resonant. The strings found their line, moving together as one voice. The woodwinds breathed in unison, their entries precise and confident. The students felt it. You could see it in their faces, the way they sat up straighter, the way they glanced at each other with something like surprise. In the back row of the orchestra, an elderly man with white hair and a violin sat perfectly still. His name was Klaus. He'd been a member of the Vienna Philharmonic for 40 years before retiring. Now he volunteered with the youth program, helping where he could. He was staring at Gregor's hands. The piece ended. The final note hung in the air. Then silence. Gregor lowered his hands. He looked at the students. "Better," he said simply. "Again tomorrow. Same time." Klaus stood. His bow slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. Everyone turned. The old man's face had gone pale. His mouth opened, closed. He stared at Gregor like he'd seen a ghost. "Mein Gott," Klaus whispered. The room held its breath. Lindemann Richter. The name cut through the silence like a blade. One of the students in the violin section leaned toward her neighbor. "Who?" Klaus didn't take his eyes off Gregor. His voice shook when he spoke again, louder this time. "One of the greatest conductors of his generation. We thought he was dead." No one moved. Gregor stood at the podium, baton still in his hand. His face showed nothing, but something in his posture shifted. A tightness in his shoulders. A slight change in the way he held himself. Christoph stepped forward from his place by the door. His voice was calm, steady. "Not dead, Klaus. Just away." Klaus gripped the back of his chair. "But I saw you conduct Mahler at the Musikverein 2001. It was extraordinary. You were being courted by La Scala, the Met, and then you just vanished." The students were looking between Klaus and Gregor now, confused, curious, beginning to understand that something significant was happening. Christoph crossed the room. He looked at Katerina and Marcus in the back row. His expression was unreadable. "And recently fired from this building on false charges," Christoph said. His voice carried, deliberate, by someone who didn't know who she was destroying. Every head in the room turned. All eyes landed on Katerina. Her face had gone white. Marcus Weber stood. His chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. He stared at Gregor, then at Christoph, then back at Gregor. "Lindemann Richter," Marcus said slowly. "The conductor?" Christoph nodded. "Yes. I saw you conduct Beethoven's Ninth. Berlin, 2001. Marcus's voice was quiet, careful. "It was extraordinary." The students were whispering now, pulling out phones. searching the name. One girl in the violin section gasped and turned her screen toward the boy beside her. Marcus turned to look at Katerina. His expression was unreadable. "You had this man fired?" Katerina's mouth opened, closed. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair. "I didn't know who he was," she said. Her voice was tight, defensive. "He was working security. He didn't—" "You had him fired," Marcus repeated. Louder this time. Katerina stood. Her composure was cracking. "There was a complaint. Inappropriate conduct. The board." "What complaint?" Christoph cut in. His voice was calm but sharp. "I've reviewed the file. There are no specifics, no witness statements, no incidents logged. Just a vague accusation from an outside source with significant financial leverage." Marcus looked at Katerina. "Your foundation?" Katerina's face flushed. "I had concerns, legitimate concerns about—" "About what?" Christoph stepped closer to the back row. "About a man who paid for your dinner? Who treated you with more grace than you deserved? Or about a man who made you feel small without saying a word?" The students were silent now, watching. 20 pairs of eyes moving between the adults like spectators at a tennis match. Katerina's hands trembled. She pressed them flat against her sides. "I didn't know," she said again. But the words sounded hollow. Even she didn't believe them. Marcus rubbed his face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. The voice of someone choosing words carefully, because they would have consequences. "Frau von Ehrenberg, I think it would be best if you left." Katerina's breath caught. "Marcus, the Foundation's relationship with this institution will need to be reevaluated, given the circumstances." The word hung in the air. Reevaluated, not ended, not severed, but the threat was clear. Katerina stood frozen, her perfect posture, her expensive clothes, her carefully constructed authority, all of it useless now. She looked at Gregor. He stood at the podium, baton still in his hand, watching her with the same quiet expression he'd worn at dinner. No anger, no triumph, just calm. It made everything worse. Katerina turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked against the floor. Each step felt like a public execution. The students watched her leave. Some looked away. Others stared openly. The door closed behind her. The studio was silent. Marcus cleared his throat. He looked at Gregor. "Herr Lindemann Richter, on behalf of the Staatsoper, I apologize. This should never have happened." Gregor nodded once. "Thank you. We'd like to reinstate you. Full benefits. Back pay for the time you've lost. And if you're willing, we'd be honored to have you return in any capacity you choose." The students leaned forward. Klaus gripped the back of his chair. Christoph stood perfectly still. Gregor set the baton down on the music stand in front of him. He looked at the orchestra. 20 young faces staring at him with something like awe. "I appreciate the offer," Gregor said quietly. "But I don't want my old life back." Marcus blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I walked away from conducting for a reason. That hasn't changed." Christoph stepped forward. "Gregor." "But I'll work with the orchestra," Gregor continued, "if you'll have me. Part-time. Thursdays and Saturdays. No performances at the Musikverein, no galas, just rehearsals, just teaching." Christoph's face shifted. Relief. Understanding. "That's more than enough," Christoph said. Gregor turned back to the students. "We'll pick up here next week. Same piece, same time. Work on the transitions between movements. They're still rough." A girl in the cello section raised her hand tentatively. "Yes? Can I ask you something?" Gregor nodded. "Why did you stop conducting? If you were that good?" The question hung in the air. Gregor's hands rested on the podium. His wedding ring caught the light. "Because I lost someone," he said simply. "And I needed to raise my daughter. That mattered more." The girl nodded slowly, like she understood. Maybe she did. Gregor picked up the baton and the cloth. He wrapped it carefully, tucked it under his arm. "See you next Thursday." He walked toward the door. The students watched him pass. Some whispered. Others sat in silence. Klaus was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Christoph caught up to Gregor in the hallway. "Thank you," Christoph said, "for coming back." "I'm not back, not really." "Close enough." They walked together through the empty corridors, the same hallways Gregor had walked for 4 years with a flashlight and a uniform. Now he walked them with a baton under his arm and something that felt almost like purpose. At the employee entrance, Christoph stopped. "The board will handle the reinstatement paperwork. And Gregor?" Gregor turned. "Annalisa would be proud of you." Gregor's throat tightened. He nodded once and pushed through the door. Outside, the air was cold. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the street. Vienna moved around him. Cars, pedestrians. The city indifferent to the small earthquake that had just happened inside. Gregor walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. One missed call. Emma. He called her back. She answered on the second ring. "Papa, how did it go?" Gregor looked back at the Staatsoper, the building where he'd once been celebrated, where he'd been forgotten, where he'd just been remembered. "It went well, Kleine." "Are you coming home?" "Yes. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Okay. I love you." "I love you too." He ended the call and started walking. The baton was still tucked under his arm. Annalisa's baton. The one she'd given him 14 years ago when everything had been possible, and the future had stretched out bright and endless. He'd held on to it through 4 years of silence. And now, finally, he was ready to use it again. 6 months later, the youth orchestra performed their first public concert. The venue was small, a community hall in Vienna's 7th district with wooden floors and folding chairs. Maybe 100 people in the audience, parents, friends, a few music teachers from neighboring schools. Nothing like the grand stages Gregor had once commanded. But it was enough. Gregor stood at the front of the orchestra. The students sat with their instruments ready, nervous, excited. 6 months of Thursday and Saturday rehearsals had brought them here. In the front row, Emma sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a blue dress Frau Meyer had helped her pick out. Her hair was pulled back. She looked older than 10. But when she caught Gregor's eye, she smiled, and she looked exactly like the little girl who hummed in her sleep. Gregor raised his hands. The room quieted. The baton came down. The music began. It wasn't perfect. A violin entrance came in slightly early. The clarinets rushed through a transition in the third movement. But the heart of it was there. The students played with focus, with confidence, with the knowledge that they were capable of something beautiful. Gregor conducted the way Annalisa had taught him. Not with grand gestures, with small, precise movements that drew the sound he wanted from each section. His hands told them when to breathe, when to swell, when to pull back. Emma watched her father, really watched him. And for the first time, she understood. This was who he'd been. This was what he'd walked away from. This was what he was finding his way back to. The final movement built toward its climax. The strings soared. The brass answered. The percussion held the foundation steady. And then, with one final gesture from Gregor, The piece ended. Silence. Then, applause. The students stood. Gregor turned to face the audience and gestured to the orchestra. The applause grew louder. Parents wiped their eyes. Frau Meyer sat in the third row, beaming. Emma clapped until her hands hurt. After the concert, after the students had packed their instruments and the parents had taken photos, Gregor found Emma waiting by the door. "You were amazing," she said. Gregor knelt down. "We were amazing. The orchestra did the work. But you made them sound like that. They made themselves sound like that. I just helped them see what they could do." Emma hugged him. Tight. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "Can we go somewhere?" she asked. "Where?" "To see Mama." The cemetery was quiet, cold. The sun had set an hour ago, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the headstones. Gregor and Emma walked hand in hand down the familiar path. Annelise's grave was simple. A flat stone with her name, her dates. First violinist, Vienna Philharmonic. Beloved wife and mother. Gregor and Emma stood in front of it. The air smelled like earth and winter. "Tell me about her," Emma said quietly. Gregor's chest tightened. He'd avoided this conversation for 4 years, but Emma wasn't asking any more. She was ready. "She was brilliant," Gregor said. "The best violinist I ever heard. She could make her instrument sing in a way that made you forget it was wood and strings." Emma looked up at him, listening. "We met at a rehearsal. I was guest conducting. She was in the first chair. I gave her a note about phrasing, and she told me I was wrong." Gregor smiled. "She was right. What else? She loved terrible jokes. The worse they were, the harder she laughed. She drank her coffee black. She couldn't cook to save her life. She read books about history and art and fell asleep with them open on her chest." Emma's hand tightened around his. "She wanted you more than anything," Gregor continued. His voice broke slightly. "When you were born, she held you and cried. Happy tears. She said you were the best thing we'd ever made together. Do you think she'd be proud of me?" "Yes, absolutely yes." "Do you think she'd be proud of you?" Gregor looked down at the grave, at Annelise's name carved into stone. "I hope so," he said quietly. They stood together in silence, father and daughter. The wind moved through the bare trees. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed. "I miss her," Emma whispered. "Me too. But I'm glad you're playing music again." Gregor pulled Emma close. "Me too, Kleine." 3 weeks later, Katharina von Ehrenberg sat alone in her apartment. The same apartment where she'd once hosted cocktail parties for Vienna's cultural elite. Now the rooms were quiet, empty. The invitations had stopped coming. Her calls went unreturned. The Foundation's board had asked her to step down temporarily while they re-evaluated their relationship with the Staatsoper. Temporary had become permanent. The woman who'd mocked a security guard's clothes was now the woman who'd tried to destroy a legend. And Vienna's memory was long. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood at the window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Gregor Lindemann Richter was conducting a youth orchestra, living a quiet life, raising his daughter, and she was here, alone, undone by her own cruelty. The wine tasted bitter. On a cold March morning, Gregor walked Emma to school, the same route they'd walked for 4 years, past the kebab shop, past the corner store, through the park where pigeons scattered at their approach. But something was different now. Emma hummed as they walked. A melody from the concert. Mozart. Gregor recognized it immediately. Without thinking, he began to hum with her. Their voices blended. hers high and clear, his deeper, perfectly in tune. Father and daughter making music together in the cold Vienna air. Emma looked up at him and smiled. Gregor smiled back. They reached the school gates. Emma hugged him, told him she loved him, ran toward the building where her friends were waiting. Gregor watched her go, small and fierce and perfect. He thought about Anneliese, about the life they'd built together, about the life he'd built after losing her, about the life he was building now. He was still humble, still quiet, still living in the same cramped apartment in Favreton, but he wasn't hiding anymore. True worth is not shown by what you display. It's revealed in what you protect, what you endure, and what you refuse to let others diminish in you or those you love. Gregor turned and walked back through the park. The morning sun broke through the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. He hummed the rest of the melody, all the way home.